Welcome into another edition of the Prep Extra podcast. I'm Colton Stone alongside, as always, Chris Basnett, and today joined by Nate Thomas.
The three-man weave today.
Three-man weave as we get into girls' state basketball. Boys district finals start Monday, wrap up Tuesday. Boys will be next week. Not a whole lot to get into because by the time we talk about it, we'll be wrong. So, focus on the girls this week. Jam-packed week at Pinnacle Bank Arena as well as the Devaney Sports Center. And, Class A, we've got our fair share of LPS flavor. We've got some areas you go down B and C1. Gets a little murkier as we go a little deeper down, but Class A is where a lot of the focus is going to be. We've got 3 Lincoln schools, and they're all, Lincoln High is probably the one that we expected the most to be there, showed the most throughout the season, best seed out of the 3. So I guess to start, whoever wants to start, what does Lincoln High have to do to get to that final, likely against Millard South?
When you talk about Lincoln High, I obviously talk about their defense. They'll press you all 94 feet for most of the game off of made baskets and, dead balls. And it's going to take a lot for them just because I don't think that they have a ton of size matched up against a team maybe like Millard North too that also is, a defense-heavy style. But Lincoln High can go 6 deep. They have 6 players that can come on the court and really score the ball. Everybody creates individually. I think they're a team that's definitely made to play in the state tournament this year. But, obviously, getting to the final, it looks like the most likely scenario for them just because of how good Millard South has been this season.
You talk about Lincoln High, and they kind of broke through last year, getting to state, winning a game. Hadn't done that in years and years and years. And you have to think that's really going to help them this year because I was at that Lincoln High game last year, that semifinal game, and it was the atmosphere was unbelievable. It was loud, it was packed, and that can make it tough if you haven't been in that position, whether you're a favorite or not. And now you've been there, you're probably favored in your first round game. You don't want to look ahead too much, but you look at that second round game, potentially facing Millard North, or you're facing another city school. That's going to be a wild atmosphere, and that's something that shouldn't bother Lincoln High. So the physical part of it, we know they're physically talented enough to do it, but I think what's going to help Lincoln High is they've been there, and they understand how that stage works.
Yeah, and they've been on this mission, it seemed like, for the past month and a half. They had, 2 games since the HAC tournament that have been decided by single digits or less. They've been blowing everybody out, and they're just getting themselves ready to play in the state tournament atmosphere that is March and this week.
That's the thing too. I think that's kind of the sign of a really good team. That's kind of an obvious thing to say. Well, they blow everybody out, but when you beat teams the way Lincoln High beats teams, that shows, I think, how dominant you are against your peers, and that can be true, of a lot of classes, but it's maybe different than a C1 school beating a D2 school. Lincoln High is doing this against Class A competition, high level competition, and there's good in that because it shows that you can be dominant. There's a little bad that you haven't maybe been pushed for a little while. And if it gets tight in state, we've all seen that too, right? Where it can be tough. But I think that's one of the things I really like about this team is that they're 23-1. Yes, they're the 3 seed, yes, but the way they've played, like you said, since the HAC tournament has just been really impressive.
Yeah, look at the flip side of that game. You've got Millard North against North Star, as you mentioned. Lincoln High would maybe have to go up against Millard North. What does North Star have to do to be frisky against Millard North, who's also been pretty dominant all year?
I guess one of those things is they need their scoring depth to really show. They have 3 players that are scoring in double figures so far this season, and they're going to need every bit that they can get against a really stingy Millard North defense. And Millard North, while they haven't been there in a few seasons, they've got that pedigree of winning state tournaments. Most recently did it in 2019. They've been there. Maybe it's not these players, but they know what it takes to win in the state tournament. And North Star just doesn't have that experience as of now. But sometimes what you don't know is good for you.
Exactly.
You can come in as the underdogs with no pressure on yourselves. They're playing with house money at this point after they beat Pius in the district final. So, it's going to be a really good learning experience, win or lose, for the young navigators up at North Star.
Too young to know better is the thing you hear a lot of coaches say. They're too young to know that they should be nervous in this situation. I watched North Star in that district final. That's at Pius in a really good atmosphere, and you're playing a team similar to Millard North, a championship pedigree, a team that's there year after year after year, and they hung right in there. They never let the game get away from them. It looked like they had it won at the end of regulation. Pius pulls off a miracle to tie it, and it would have been real easy for North Star to fold in that situation. Starting 3 freshmen, starting a sophomore, not bringing a whole lot of people off the bench. That's the crew they stuck with, and they're down 4 in overtime. And you go, okay, well, this was kind of fun, and then they turn around. Annie Lou, freshman, hits a 3, 4 seconds left, and now they're at the state tournament. So, yeah, you wonder how they'll handle the atmosphere, but I think you're right, Nate. They're in a position where if they can approach this in a way that says, you know what, we've got to have fun with this, and win or lose, we're going to just go have a great time, and what maybe will be, they'll have a shot. You never know. Stranger things have happened, right? That's why you play the game. So yeah, that's going to be a fun one to watch.
And then looking at the top side, you've got Millard South playing Southwest, obviously, and then in the 4-5 game, we've got the 2 Bellevue schools going up against each other. Southwest has a tall task coming up. That Millard South has looked far and away as the best team in Class A, 24-2. Chris, you and I always talk about, it seems like, especially in boys basketball, a lot of the power lies in the Metro. Seems like it's kind of been, outside of Lincoln High, it's kind of been that way for girls basketball this year as well. Is there some way Southwest can disrupt Millard South and they're going to win this game? How can they do that?
Well, it's a lot different than when they played 2-3 weeks ago when Millard South won by 30. Kennedy Williams is back from Lincoln Southwest, and I think we saw the impact that she has on that Silverhawk team when she played in the district final. Led the team in scoring, led the game in scoring with 17. Like, she's a really good player, and she changes the trajectory of Southwest by a mile. You talk about another young team that, they have 2 seniors that play. They kind of carry that group throughout most of the season, but having Kennedy Williams back just changes a lot of things for them. They have a second ball handler. They have a lead guard that can step up and defend Millard South, any of the 3 Division I players for the Patriots. It's going to be a really interesting game just to see if it's any different from what happened 2.5-3 weeks ago. But it'll be a fun one either way.
Let's not forget Lincoln Southwest beat Millard South last year in the state tournament when nobody thought they were going to do it. And I think you look at this game, if you're Lincoln Southwest and you're telling your players, look, all the pressure in the world's on Millard South. They've got an unbelievable record the last 3-4 years. 20 losses in the last 4 years, 5 years, 0 state titles. This is kind of it for them, for this group anyway. If they're going to do it, it has to be this year. And now all of a sudden you look across the bracket, and it's the team that beat you last year, who's got their best player back, essentially playing a home game on the same court where they beat you last year. That's tough for Millard South. And I'm not saying Lincoln Southwest is going to come out and win this game, but they've done it once. You have to think their confidence is really, really high right now, especially, like you said, getting Kennedy Williams back. So I don't know if it's maybe the foregone conclusion a lot of people think it might be. And like you said, getting Kennedy Williams back, that just changes the whole trigonometry of everything, right? It doesn't make this game a toss-up, but it makes it a lot closer than it might have been, a week or 2 ago.
Yep, and one of the things Tim Barrett told me after they won their district semifinal was they didn't have to beat Bellevue West 10 times, they just had to beat them once.
Exactly.
And they know that they're the underdogs every game that they played through here on out in the postseason. And when you have 2 seniors and a junior that have been there before and you tell them you don't have anything to lose, it's a battle for them. Like, they're going to come out and they're going to compete. Yeah.
It's a deal, too. Let's not forget, Lincoln Southwest darn near won the state title last year. Lost a close game to a really good Fremont team. And like you said, they've been there. They've been under the lights. So I think that might be the most fun game of the day on that first day.
Moving on to Class B, I think the biggest storyline here is going to be how do we avoid Elkhorn North versus Omaha Skutt. You've got Waverly taking on Skutt in the 2 versus 7, Norris taking on Elkhorn North in the 1 versus 8. It seems like that we're just on that collision course. It just seems like it's going to be Elkhorn North, Omaha Skutt. How is it not Elkhorn North, Omaha Skutt?
Well, it's kind of hard to find a reason why it wouldn't be those two, just because those two have just ran through everybody in Class B. Like, a game for them hasn't been close. If you look at Elkhorn North, their one loss was to Omaha Skutt the first game of the season. Omaha Skutt hasn't lost to a Nebraska opponent yet this season. Like those two have just been running through everybody, and it just seems like there's nothing that's going to get in their way unless it's just some catastrophic circumstances where, a team gets hot from three in a second half or something like that.
I think the one thing that can maybe throw a wrench into this is how good is Sydney, and it kind of becomes a tired thing every year. But from this part of the state, we don't see those teams in the Panhandle a whole lot. And you're talking about a team that's 24-2, has kind of done what we talked about with Lincoln High. They kind of blow everybody out. So they do what you want them to do. What's the level of competition? Like, they haven't seen a Scott. They haven't seen an Elkhorn North. They're going to be under the bright lights. They're going to play a Beatrice team that's 17-4 and is 40 miles down the road and has again some pedigree in the postseason. So I kind of agree with you guys. It's tough to see this going any other direction than a state volleyball rematch where it was Scott and Elkhorn North who played just an epic state final in Class B in volleyball. I don't think a lot of people would be too mad if that happened again in basketball. That's two great teams full of great players, and right now, like you said, barring something really unforeseen, it looks like those two in the finals.
Yeah, those two have the three best players in the class: Molly Ladwig, Peyton McCabe, and Britt Prince. And those are three of the best players in the state, regardless of class too.
Yeah,
it's going to be an absolutely electric final if it happens. Considering how close that first game was when they played night one of the season, that was an absolutely crazy game too. That happens again, it's going to be fun.
Yeah.
But you have to still look down the line and say, like, well, what if a York comes out and shoots well and they play good defense? What happens if Scotts Bluff comes out and plays up to the potential that that they have?
Yeah.
Or a Norris comes out and knocks down shots. Waverly's even a tough test too. Like, none of these schools are really pushovers, but it just seems like Elkhorn North and Scott are just better than the six teams in the field.
Yeah, and looking, of course, like you said, you look at records, seems like some of these would be more even matchups than they might be, but we don't get to see every game. We don't get to travel everywhere. What is, like you said, what does Scotts Bluff have to offer? What, depending on how they play against York, does that give them some kind of confidence against Elkhorn North? Mm-hmm. If Norris comes out inspired, if you knock down enough threes, you can take a big enough lead and hopefully, coast to a win. But it seems like, again, that one more so than Class A feels like we're more on a collision course for those two teams. But any given night, it is still a toss-up as you go down all those games.
It's the oldest cliche in the book. You got to play the games, right?
That's right.
You don't play them on paper, and what it looks like on paper may not happen. But it looks like what's on paper might actually actually happen here.
And that's the same exact thing we said with volleyball was, these two feel like they're the best teams, and it ended up happening. It just kind of feels like these are the two best teams that it's going to happen again.
Yeah.
So.
Looking at C1, just one Lincoln school. We've got Lincoln Christian playing Bridgeport in the 2-7. Bridgeport 24-0. Christian not a pushover, 22-3. That'll be an interesting matchup. What does Christian have to do get past a potent Bridgeport team?
Well, the one thing that they need to do is somehow find a way to, I guess, match up against Bridgeport's size. You talk about the Loomis Girdle girls, like, they're tall. And they're taller than everybody else in that class, it feels like.
And they can handle the ball, too.
Yeah,
on top of that.
Yep. Kennedy Ailes is Lincoln Christian's best player. She's their tallest player at, 6 foot, 6'1". She kind of not a super physical player, and it's going to be a really tough battle for her to try and guard those two. And Lincoln Christian just isn't a very tall or physical team in general. So I'm interested to see how physical they can come out if they play very inspired. They're coming out with the first-year coach, Scott Klein, and they're coming with, players that have not played in the state tournament before, let alone even a district final. Yeah. They had one player on their roster that had played in a district final before last week. So it's going to be very interesting to see if Lincoln Christian can kind of play the role of Cinderella. But Bridgeport just feels like they're going to be right there in the final again. It's just, who is it going to be up against?
Again, a team that made the state final last year in Bridgeport, lost a close game, returned a whole lot of that roster, including, like you said, two of the best players in the class. So probably favored there. Outside of that, you kind of look at the rest of this bracket. I think it's really interesting. North Bend Central, who's obviously been there a bunch the last few years, one loss on the season. Wahoo and Malcolm playing for what feels like about the 17th time this year in the first round. That's two quality teams. Adams Central's 24-1. They've been right there at the top of the ratings all year. Gothenburg's had a really nice year. So this is one of the deeper classes, I think. Again, Bridgeport kind of looks like the favorite, but there's probably 3 or 4 teams here that have a pretty legitimate shot to win this thing.
Yeah, and North Bend Central and Bridgeport have kind of felt like the 2 best teams the entire season. If Adams Central can come into the state tournament and play like really good basketball, they could probably knock off Bridgeport. But we feel kind of on that collision course again, just like Class B for North Bend Central and Bridgeport. North Bend Central, 3 state tournaments in a row that they've won now. Caitlin Emanuel is, going to go down as one of the greatest high school basketball players of all time in this state.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to count them out. Their first loss came, or I guess their only loss came first night of the season against Bishop Neumann.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, Bishop Newman's like not a very good team, but a lot has changed over the course of 3 months since then. And you talk about the East Husker Conference, that's one of the toughest conferences in girls sports in the state, no matter what sport it is. And they ran through that conference tournament.
Yeah.
None of those games were within 20.
Yeah.
So it probably feels like those two. Like I said, Adams Central is kind of right there. Just because they have the size and physicality that can probably match a lot of teams in C1 or outmatch. But it's C1's deep, and it's going to be really fun.
Yeah.
All right, maybe we'll hit a little lightning round here as we start to drop off some of our area, and we get very fringe here. But Class C2, Crofton top seed at 23-2, and you've got 2 seed Pender at 24-3. What is there to keep an eye on here in Class C2?
C2 is a carousel. I think that's probably the easiest way to say it. Like, there's been like 4 or 5 different teams in that class that have been ranked number 1 this season. Like Archbishop Bergen, I think, was the team that held the number 1 spot in the rankings this season, I guess the longest. They lost in a district final. I think it just goes to tell you how even C2 is and how fun C2 is going to be this week. Crofton just lost to Ponca in sub-district final. Those 2 could play in the semifinals. Like, there's going to be a lot of interesting games to come out of this class this weekend.
Moving on to D1.
Mm-hmm.
We'll keep the lightning round going.
Sure.
Really fun bracket here. Ravenna, the 1 seed, Centura, the 2 seed. That's 2 conference rivals in the Lou Platte Conference. They're about 15 miles apart. They see each other every year, multiple times a year. They played each other 3 times this year. Ravenna won the first 2. Centura won the third in sub-districts. That's going to be a really fun final if it happens. Again, you have to get there first. Ravenna, SEM, Centura were all in the same sub. And now you've got Ravenna, SEM playing in a first-round game at state. This is an interesting class because you've got a lot of teams that you'd normally see in a C1 or a C2 state tournament. We mentioned Ravenna, Centura. Hastings St. Cecilia's won 3 out of the last 4 C2 titles and finished second in C1 the last 4 years. They've competed at the next class up, the next 2 classes up, and that's where they've been for a long time. You look at the record, 17-7, and it doesn't jump off the page, but the type of schedule they play in the Centennial Conference. The quality of opponents they're playing every year. They're going to be really, really good defensively. That's a really tough opening matchup for Elmwood Murdoch, the area team in the bracket for the Journal Star here. The Knights making their 3rd appearance in a row. They have yet to get out of the first round. Now to do that, all you've got to do is go beat St. Cecilia, who's here every year. So good luck. It's the bottom half of that bracket to Cedar Catholic, another team that's kind of always there. They had a really good run in volleyball, made the state final in volleyball. Johnson Broxton State for the first time in a long time. That's kind of your fun story there. So some interesting storylines, I think, in D1, kind of headlined by what we said, those 2 kind of conference foes that Nate, you've kind of had right at the top of the rankings all year long.
Yep, those 2 have probably separated themselves from the rest of the class the second half of the season. But, those top 4, you mentioned Cedar Catholic and Hastings St. Cecilia, like those are 2 really good teams too, and I would not be shocked if one of them are in the final.
Yeah. Moving on to D2, surprise, surprise, Fall City Sacred Heart is the top seed in Class D2. Shelton, who made a state final last year in D1, is your 2 seed with 1 loss. O'Neill St. Mary's, always really good in this bracket. 4 seed McCool Junctions, that's kind of a fun story there, one of the best scorers in the state. They're playing Humphrey St. Francis, who, by the way, is also here every single year, it feels like. So this is a fun bracket, I think. You've kind of got the the established programs, the classic perennial powerhouses. You've also got some new blood too, which I think is going to make it fun. Layton's in the tournament for the first time in a long time and has the leading scorer in the state. And so a lot of interesting storylines here, but then you kind of look at the bracket and go, okay, yeah, it's probably Fall City, Sacred Heart, and probably Shelton on the other side.
Yep, and it's been Fall City, Sacred Heart, and Humphrey St. Francis the past 2 years in the final, and we may get that in the semifinal, which is, really fun just because of the, rivalry that those two have in, basketball and volleyball. So I think D2 will be interesting. It's been Shelton and Fall City, Sacred Heart the entire season at 1 and 2, so yeah, if that happens in the final, that's going to be a good one.
Yeah. Yeah, and you look at, again, one of the teams I didn't mention, why not? You look at their state record, the last decade or so, 15 years, really, really good. And Wilcox-Hildreth is a first-timer here. Welcome to the state tournament, Wilcox-Hildreth. Here's like 4 of the best programs in the class for the last several years. So, yeah, it's a deal where we talked about the left side, ABC1 kind of being the brackets we'll have the most teams in our coverage area, but there's no shortage of good stories all over this bracket. It's the best time of the year. We love the state tournament. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have wall-to-wall coverage for you starting Wednesday with the first round. We're back to a 4-day format this year. The girls and boys are separate after being together.
Yep.
Last year.
A one and done. I hope they never have it the same week ever again.
Let's hope that never happens again. So, yeah, stay tuned to journalstar.com. We're going to have you covered all throughout the week. We're going to be at just about every game. So stay tuned, and we'll have all the highlights for you.